Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the University of the Western Cape. On behalf of the Center for Humanities Research in particular, I want to thank you for attending this very, very important session, this opportunity to listen to 4 speakers tonight. So I'm hoping that you will stay the course with us. 1980s, 1987 to be precise, this university hosted a debate between Jakes Gerwel and Neville Alexander. And it was on the occasion of Jakes declaring this university an intellectual home for the democratic left. And on that occasion, Neville Alexander offered a critique of Jakes' vision for this university, but more broadly for what a post-apartheid university might look like. In Neville's sense, there was a concern and a worry about the university emerging as what he called a left Bantustan. And so there was an ongoing debate, a very productive discussion that has followed through for years and years at UWC. And I'm hoping that this would be an occasion like that moment in 1987 where we opened up the question so broadly that we had enough work for 20 years. So that's the big demand tonight on our 4 speakers. I'm not going to do a very long introduction. I'm going to invite David Theo Goldberg to address us first. David is joining us from U Irvine. He's known as a scholar of critical race theory. Many of you have read his most recent work on the problems of post-racialism. So without further ado, I'm going to invite David.
I'm going to talk a bit about the transformation in the structure of the university. Taking off from the American case, but I think the American case is a kind of leading edge for what is happening more globally in all kinds of places, including what's coming to a campus near you soon in South Africa. So if you think about the history of public universities sort of emerging in the late 19th century, and increasingly into the 20th century, they became very quickly what I would call a kind of middle-classing institution. That is, they were designed to pull into a kind of democratic citizenship, the formation, the making of a middle class, not just in terms of the kind of professionalization of work into which graduates would be admitted, but also into a kind of public conversation and set of activities that came to constitute the middle class. And by the 1980s, this very quickly started to come. I mean, it probably started a bit earlier, but by the 1980s it became palpable, certainly with Reagan in the US, Thatcher in Britain, and other things going on. This began to be called into question, and you began to get an erosion of the university as a public good. Right? As you got an erosion of the very nature, more generally, of public goods per se. And so the emergence of the neoliberalizing moment from the end of the 70s or beginning of the 1980s onwards, sort of becoming public, you began to see the beginning of deeper and deeper cuts over 25, 30, 40 years to the university. In very, very palpable ways, particularly to public universities, in very palpable ways, as I say, in the US, but elsewhere as well. So if you think just to take 3 quick examples to give you an idea of how deep these cuts ran. In 2000, the University of California system, which at the time was a $15 billion corporation or operation, right? 27% of the UC budget was provided by the state, which meant, of course, that 73% was provided, in some other way, but it was still a significant 27% because it underpinned faculty salaries and things of that kind. 15 years later, it is now something like 10% of a $25 billion budget. right? So it's down very, very significantly, and that has come necessarily to be seen to be replaced, right, by other sorts of what are called revenue streams or revenue sources, and one has to ask what they are. There are comparable considerations elsewhere. Michigan, 9% provided by the state, the University of Michigan. University of Virginia, 6%. So these, you could say that they're public only in name now, although importantly the state continues to own both the land and the buildings, or at least they underwrite the bonds for building buildings on that land. And so they, in a way, they're getting by cheaply, right? I mean, their investment is shrunk and shrunk and shrunk, and they still claim to be sort of public kinds of institutions. You see the same thing in Britain with the erosion of public funding for the university. And so, the kind of move is to replace them by various sorts of undertakings or ventures, the most immediate of which is to raise student fees, right? So the first, in the US, fees have doubled pretty much, in the last few years, since, say, 2008, at pretty much every public institution you can point to. In Britain, overnight, fees went from £0 to £9,000 a year, and so on. So it's to make up the gap, right, in order to continue to provide the kind of learning conditions and resources available. And so it also meant turning to revenue-generating ventures, right? Increasingly, what was privileged was less the funding of research than, supporting research that could fund itself, supporting programs that could fund themselves, that would bring in revenue, that would support other parts of the university. There was a massive increase at the higher levels of administration, so from 1980 to 2005 in the US, upper administration increased by 437% as faculty positions were being curtailed, right? So you got a decrease in faculty, a massive increase in administration. It wasn't just administration feeding themselves. They in part were responding to mandates from the state or from the federal government that required oversight and so on and so forth, paperwork. And so it wasn't all as straightforward as we like to think, but it was still very telling. Increasingly, the ground level of administration, the lower levels of administration, were downloaded onto faculty, right? I mean, as the departmental administration was eroded, faculty had to do more and more administration ourselves, right? As the upper level of oversight administration was ballooning. And so you had these dramatic shifts sort of taking place in which there were fees for everything, right? Increasingly, there were fees for renting rooms in order to run a conference on campus. There were fees for telephone lines. Increasingly, telephones went, the way of the dinosaur, right? In faculty offices, replaced by personal cell phones. So you were picking up the cost of conducting kind of faculty business on the part of the institution, and so on and so forth. So you've got these series of moves that take place. The generation of grants that would produce indirect costs, so costs that would return to the university of 50%, right? So you're getting a grant of a couple of $1 million, but you're only getting half that money in your pocket because the rest of the grant was going to pay for the bricks and mortar and so on, and operations of the university. You got emerging at the same point in time massive online open courses, that failed experiment that was supposed to democratize education, right? That very quickly, the people, 150,000 people were lining up for courses like Introduction to Computer Science. Less than 10% were completing the course globally, right? So you see the way in which it was going. Most importantly, you got a radical adjunctification of the labor force of the university. The casualization of the service labor, but the casualization also of the teaching labor of the university, which meant that the university, in the US, in the years from 1975 to today, adjunctification went from 43% to over 70% of the teaching faculty in the university. No benefits, no health benefits, no pension plan. So in a sense, there's an erosion of the working conditions under which teaching is taking place. And of course, then also tenure erosion. You see this most recently at the university, in the University of Wisconsin system, but tenure generally has come under massive constraint in all kinds of places, so people can be hired and fired in a sense at will, 1-year contracts, 2 or 3-year contracts. And as I say, the kind of tuition doubled. So I want to call this the Uberization of the university, right? Or the Uberversity, in short. Now, what do I mean by this? I mean that the Uberversity has moved from, of the public university in particular, but maybe universities in general, have moved from the providing of the grounding for a kind of lifelong learning experience, as well as the capacity not just to get good jobs, the kind of skilling of labor, but also engage in the democratic process as citizens. I mean, the sort of standard classical view of what the university was supposed to be doing, to becoming a platform for experience, right? What I mean by that, as students were being turned into consumers or prosumers, to use the language of the day, right? As sort of innovation, entrepreneurial innovation kicked into the university and so on, increasingly universities found themselves investing less in the learning experience than in the recreational or the overall experience of going to college as such, right? Climbing walls, gyms, fancy swimming pools, which we like, of course. All those kinds of things that are surrounding the learning experience, but not directly speaking to the learning experience itself. And learning increasingly became the skillification of labor, right? Rather than any kind of critical thinking sets of engagement, any slow reading of texts that we associate with the humanities. And indeed, humanities faculty come under increasing duress as the university wants to close down the sites of critical kind of engagement, not least of its own set of practices. And so, as with Uber, I mean the analogy quite directly, right? I mean, when you call for an Uber cab, right, you can, on your phone, you can map, right, the route that it's taking to get to you and the time it takes to get to you. So the learning experience becomes mapped, right, by technology at the university in order to determine and shrink time to degree, right? So both the faculty and the students are being mapped in this kind of way. I mean, at the University of California, my colleagues will attest to this, every year you've got to take an online test for important things like sexual harassment, anti-sexual harassment activity and so on. Only that, you've got 2 hours in which to do it. There's no right or wrong answers. It's basically the university looking after its own liability to show that it's offered these kinds of undertakings. And you're just being timed through the, not even now learning experience, the liability experience on the part of the university. And I want to suggest that learning itself has become something along the lines. Just as with Uber, you have a kind of crowdsourcing assessment of the ride, so you can't order another cab before you filled out your service agreement with Uber, which is to say you've got to assess what the ride was like, what the driver was like. so we're seeing the increasing crowdsourcing of the classroom experience, right? I mean, it started with Rate My Professors as a sort of casual thing of crowdsourcing. But let me give you one very telling example, which is going to be in a classroom near you soon. At the University of California, Davis, in classes of a size of this sort, right, so big introductory classes and so on, each student is now given a clicker in order, in real time, to assess the lecture that is being given by the lecturer, by me. You would all have a clicker saying, "Oh, this is so boring," right? And it would appear on the screen above your head, and you'd either see it here, and oh, they're bored, I better change in real time what the lecture looks like. Right? I'm not making this up. Right? So this is the future, I mean, the CNN-ification of, right, like the political debates. Increasingly, the university is becoming a brand, right? And what is being sold to potential students is the brand, right? The higher the brand, Harvard, excuse me, my colleagues and so on, but the higher the brand, the more you can charge for the brand, right? And the brand has its own logo, it has its own sort of corporatizing representation and so on and so forth. And this has increasingly had an effect not just on the humanities, but even on the sciences. I was surprised a couple of months ago, I was talking with a quite notable physicist on my campus who has now become the Dean of Undergraduate Education and also the Director of Technology and Education for undergraduates on the campus. And he was bemoaning the fact that when he was an undergraduate doing physics, whatever it was, 25 years ago, he was being schooled not only in the skilling of physics, the mathematics, the rote learning of physics, so to speak, but in the conceptual thinking, right, that physics requires in order to think about what problems you focus on, how you engage with those problems. And he said today, in undergraduate education in physics, that has completely disappeared. So his mission is to try and reintroduce it. And I want to suggest that that disappearance of that form of conceptual thinking is not unrelated to the kinds of activities, that kind of rote skilling formation of the learning experience that we've come to understand. So I'm quite literal about the Uberizing of the university condition. And I just want to end off by just pointing to the fact that two kinds of considerations. A, when the Uber model, that platform model, right, of consumer demand-driven crowdsourcing kinds of consideration, gets expanded to other platforms, food ordering, for example, service provision in various sorts of ways. As it has been tried, it has failed dismally. And then if you think back into the actual Uber experience itself, right, in terms of its financial operations and so on, you'll notice that it has produced no profit. And indeed, what it does is extends itself through venture capital, effectively loans, right? So what keeps it going is not your or my or our collective taking of rides. What keeps it going effectively is the way it can sell itself, right? For additional investment, which it then will owe back to its shareholders. So I think we should be very careful in thinking ourselves, right, as a university practice for all kinds of reasons, not least of which is this as well. And so the immediate future is one of increasing robotification of skilling. I think you're going to see more and more of that, right, entering into what we've come to know as the university domain, and smart algorithms auto-generating their own code, including for the learning condition. The pressure to downside the human interface of learning, to limit faculty determination of what and how things are valuable to be learned, of discounting, as I said, critical thinking, critical knowledge and thinking capacity in every sense of the term, will only intensify. As Uber's own administrative workforce testifies, in contrast to its drivers, the impact will be a further narrowing of diversity. I mean, there's a very interesting phenomenon at Uber itself, right? Its drivers are very, very demographically diverse. Its administration is totally white, right? Almost worldwide. I mean, it has a very, very thin layer of diversity at the upper corporate administrative level. And indeed, they invite new people newly joining the administration to a kind of fun and games weekend in San Francisco, right? As a kind of, we're acculturating you into the kind of Uber experience. And you look at those parties and they're overwhelmingly white, interestingly enough. So Uber has just announced also its intention to purchase $10 million worth of driverless cars. So it's joining, you could say, the roboticizing of the workforce, right? And that too is a wedge into, if you think of the Uberizing of the university, what the university is going to look like. In higher education, we're increasingly facing the distinct possibility of a faceless future, teacherless courses, the failed MOOC experiment, online everything. We should face this intensifying prospect of the Uberversity with eyes wide open, counter-clicker firmly in hand. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. Vice-Chancellor, our Vice-Chancellor has joined us. I should tell you that Professor Tyrone Pretorius, that both David and Wendy went for a swim in our swimming pool today, so that's why there was the little bit of caution in the tale about the swimming pool. There's a fee for swimming in the swimming pool. Our next speaker, Wendy Brown, is on a second visit to UWC. Wendy's book, Undoing the Demos, is known to many of us. Some of us in the CHR are engaged with it currently, and we're very happy to welcome her to UWC again.
It's a commonplace that the neoliberalization of universities produces an excruciating historical irony. The emancipatory and the inclusive dimensions of 20th century university existence are being choked off, as David just described, at exactly the moment they're needed for two things. One, to rethink the knowledges and our approaches to them that would redress historical violences and exclusions. These include colonial, sexual, classed, gendered, raced, religious, and others. And secondly, what's needed at this moment is, of course, knowledges and approaches to them that address worldwide and world historical unprecedented problems, ranging from new forms of terror, rule by finance, climate change, to formulating a just, feasible alternative to the wreckages of global capitalism in the 21st century, including the pileup of humanity, 1/8 of it now living in urban and suburban slums. So we know all this, but do we? Do we know exactly why neoliberalism has been such a disaster for generating the access, the knowledge, and the ethos that we need in universities today? Most familiar in answering this question, what neoliberalism has done to universities, pertains to the issue of privatization. And at its most general level, privatization means, as David just suggested, shifting universities from public entities largely supported by the public, by the state, to private ones largely paid for by a combination of students, donors, and the so-called public-private partnerships, which are really private interests usually acquiring reputational enhancement by using public monies. At the more detailed and particular level, privatization means reformatting every element of universities on a business model, from outsourced staffing to flexibilized faculty to management increasingly drawn from the corporate world rather than the intellectual, and managing according to best practices of the corporate world, largely indifferent to the very specific intellectual and human endeavor shaping universities. And we're all pretty familiar with the effects of privatization, so I'll just say very briefly, recapitulating some of what David has said, that divesting from the university as a public good in both research and education, and setting it up on a fee-for-use basis, entails, first of all, a very radical shift in the very principle of value governing university activities and purposes. Private revenue streams come with private purposes, and that changes pedagogy, curriculum, research, all of which become increasingly contoured to return on investment, where the investors are on the one hand cash-strapped or indebted students, and on the other research sponsors seeking commercially applicable research results. A second important effect of privatization has to do with new models of access. Privatized higher education loses its status as a universal right and as a mode for producing equality of opportunity, and instead becomes an intensifier of inequality and pressures universities in an increasingly vocational direction. And that means they become not just anti-critical spaces, but increasingly anti-intellectual, where everything is meant to serve a single end, producing employable bits of human capital. So there's a lot more to say about privatization, but I don't want to say it, because to really get at what's happening to universities today, we need to address a second feature of the age, an inadvertent effect of neoliberalization, namely financialization. So this is going to be a little 5-minute Cliff Note TED Talk version of financialization. Okay, financialization technically means what? Very simple thing. It means turning an asset into a financial instrument, like turning a house into mortgage collateral. But in fact, what the financialization of everything, which is the mode we are in now, has done is to radically transform almost everything in contemporary societies. It radically transforms conduct and incentive and value. Why? Because it produces economies increasingly driven by a concern with what is called shareholder value and not only profit. And that means it has transformed what was neoliberalism's insistence on entrepreneurial conduct and consumer conduct into a new kind of conduct, investor conduct. And that means incentive is altered from a concern with profit or immediate return on investment to a concern with enhancing value for future investors who will keep the value of one's entity or oneself high, and that makes credit ratings all important. So let me break that open a little bit. Privatizing universities in a financialized era means a lot more than withdrawing public funding and rationalizing them according to value for money. It means a lot more than simply importing business metrics into every fiber of the university. Universities governed by shareholder value are not so oriented by return on investment as they are by rankings and ratings across every dimension of their existence. Why? Because shareholder value isn't directly linked to profit and current return, as the frequent divergence between a company's posted earnings in any particular quarter and its stock price makes very clear. A company can lose money in a particular quarter and still have skyrocketing stock prices. Amazon can post losses but see its stock jump. Uber can be worth 40 billion but show no profit at all, as it did last year. Why? Because what matters is not the bottom line, but how would-be investors regard a firm's potential for enhancing their investment in the future. What matters is what the future shareholder value will be. So what matters, and this is the one sentence that will give you a headache because you have to follow each phrase in it, what matters is the market's assessment of a company's future promise, which is affected by market moves based on speculators' beliefs or guesses about that promise. I'm just going to say it once more because each piece of that matters. That's how financial markets work. So what matters is the market's assessment of a company's future promise, which is based on market moves that in turn are based on speculators' beliefs or their guesses about the promise of a particular entity. Now you know this, you actually know this. I'm now going to give you examples and then we'll get it to the university. In the stock market, firms are valued according to a huge range of tangibles and intangibles. How the company is run, what it's just acquired or divested from, its perceived risk exposure, who might be bidding to take it over, who its new competitors are, how its own gambles with products and pricing and niche are regarded by the industry, what future product lines it might claim to be developing, what reputational damage it may have just suffered, what new market share it might acquire, and many other things. And bonds, similarly, are rated by agencies according to their ability to hold their value, which in turn is based on both the solidity of their collateral and their ability to withstand market volatility. So South Africa, for example, is teetering on devaluation to junk bonds from its BBB- rating because of a market slowdown without adequate collateral to back those bonds. Okay, I'm about to climb out of this ditch in case you're getting a big headache and explain why this matters to universities. This form of valuation, called shareholder valuation, emanates from the stock market, but it's now spilled into every dimension of contemporary existence. Any 17-year-old can tell you, any startup investor can tell you, any university financial officer can tell you, what matters today is not immediate return on outlay. That's a shopkeeper's mentality. What matters is future value. And future value depends on speculation about ability to attract future investors, which in turn is based on the attractiveness of the entity or the person to current investors. That's why brandings and ratings have become so crucial. They've become so crucial to every entity and every being. That's why a bad Uber rating or a bad Airbnb rating is far more consequential for an Uber driver or an Airbnb host than losing a month's income. You're finished with the bad rating. You can survive the loss of immediate income. That's why you get a customer service survey for everything that you do today, from an Amazon purchase to an airline trip. All of these are contributing to the ranking and ratings that determine the value of the object or endeavor for future investors. So in short, we're not in an entrepreneurial mode of neoliberalism anymore. We're in a financialized mode. And our problem in the university is not that education is commodified or that students are customers or consumers. That was the 80s and 90s. That's over. Our problem, what's emanated from the great shift that I've just sketched in 5 minutes, but obviously we need an hour, what's revolutionized universities is that as they've been neoliberalized and privatized, they have adopted the governance practices and the values of shareholder capitalism in a financialized era. And as a shareholder value economy and culture generates ratings for investor calculations about everything, these ratings have proliferated for academia, and they govern every part of it. There are ratings, rankings for individual faculty, departments, institutions as a whole. There are rankings of graduate programs and subfields within them. There are job placement ratings, postgraduate income ratings. In the US, as David just mentioned, there are ratings for dining halls, for housing, for recreation facilities, all of which contribute to the rating of the college as a whole. There are ratings for return on investment and for what's called network advantage, which is what students gain from rubbing shoulders with one group of fellow investors rather than another. So what students gain from rubbing shoulders with students at Harvard versus Berkeley, or Stellenbosch versus Western Cape. Now, of course, there's also our own version of, it's not my view. Of course, there's also our own version of insider trading. University rankings themselves are gamed, as all markets are gamed, by absurd investments to multiply applicants, to boost test scores, to build recreation facilities, and do other things that will raise the rankings while depleting resources for serious education and research. Now, I'm suggesting that these ratings and rankings aren't just distasteful vis-a-vis the serious intellectual work we're committed to. It's not just that we're offended by the presence of the counting clerk in the philosopher's study. Rather, the point is these ratings literally govern universities by shaping practices at every level, by shaping student ethos and conduct, by shaping pedagogy, curriculum design, determining what programs will be strengthened and which ones will be allowed to starve. They shape hiring, firing, and promotion. They shape university partnerships. They shape lines of research that are pursued or eschewed. So shareholder capitalism transforms both who and what governs the university as well as what it's for. It's also radically delinked teaching and research because they're governed by different investment groups. The quaint faculty insistence that they're related refers to a kind of university holism that's literally been disintegrated by shareholder capitalism. And disciplines themselves are increasingly private niche industries with their own rating agencies. So the value of a scholar is indexed by the value of the program in which she's housed, the journals in which she publishes. Those in turn are indexed by ratings within the profession, which is generated by an ensemble of ratings, also known as impact factor. And again, all these ratings and rankings are gamed, and gaming them increasingly governs us, encouraging one kind of work, discouraging other kinds. So the disincentives here are as important as the incentives. What does all of this deter? It deters engaging with public problems and writing for publics. It deters creative interdisciplinarity, so essential for our time. It deters developing and disseminating worldly knowledge and pausing over meaning and alternative coordinates of existence. So this is what it means to be managed by the markets today, and what it means for universities to be marketized at this particular historical conjuncture, where their every function becomes indexed, rated, and governed by a financialized order in which investor confidence and expectations dictate survival or failure. Let me conclude by reflecting just for a minute on how this conjuncture bears on what I take to be the two most important projects for the university in the 21st century. And these are projects which sustain some aspects of what universities have been, but also suggest domains in which they need to be renewed. One has to do, obviously, with conducting research and offering education that is oriented to the predicaments and challenges of this world. And this kind of work includes, but isn't limited to, addressing, for example, the unprecedented transnational powers that have been humanly created, but are not under human control. It includes global integration and the volatile interregnum between nation states and whatever their successors are going to be. It includes addressing historically generated stratification and strife along economic, cultural, religious, racial, gendered, sexual, and other lines. It includes, of course, addressing climate change, resource depletion, and species destruction. It includes addressing unsustainably organized geographies. There's a much longer list, but the point is that what universities are so badly needed for, what markets and states and philanthropy cannot provide, is research and education that is dedicated not just to building human capital, but to building the human capacity to grasp and address global challenges. And this work, of course, is not just social, scientific, or technical. It includes reflecting on the epistemological and ontological assumptions that secure the existing order of things as natural and inevitable and given. It includes studying grammars and representations and methods that secure the givenness of the present. It includes probing how various knowledges are either privileged or discredited. It includes reconsidering humanism, natural histories, and so forth. So it makes the study of thinkers like Dipesh Chakrabarty and Michel Foucault, feminism and colonialism, history and reading practices, art and music, as important as studying solar and wind technologies or sustainable cities and other such things. So the issue here is not what's considered, what disciplines or what texts, but by what purpose and ethos these things are approached, by what purposes and ethos the university is organized. The second important feature that universities have to have at their heart, if they are both going to contribute to our predicaments and to understanding our predicaments and addressing them in the 21st century, and if they're going to survive at all, has to do with bringing the outsiders in, educating the historically excluded and the dispossessed, whether excluded or dispossessed by caste or class or race or ethnicity or gender or anything else. And here the point is not just to rectify historical exclusions and hierarchies. It's not just to socially integrate those who are otherwise candidates for hostility to building equitable and stable societies. It's not just to develop knowledges that challenge the dominant ones. It's all three. It's rectification, it's social incorporation, and it's radical transformation of knowledge. And again, nothing is more challenging to this dimension of what the university must do than privatization and financialization. Why? Because privatization limits access and it funnels groups of limited means toward technical training rather than worldly knowledge. Financialization induces universities to seek out those investments that boost its rankings in research and education, and that means giving priority to faculty, to students, to research areas, to programs that generate high rankings, and that means favoring the already privileged, the mainstream, the well-regarded by the highly regarded. And that is a disaster for decolonizing knowledge, for decolonizing teaching, for decolonizing admissions, and decolonizing support, fostering the kinds of inquiry by the kinds of students that we ought to be nourishing. So I'm suggesting our work today in the universities is really cut out for us. It means struggling against financialized forms of valuation in order to preserve a mission for 21st century universities. I think we're really at the brink of losing them, losing universities once and for all to other ends. And I think once lost, we won't get them back. So every part of our current movements against privatization, neoliberalism, and financialization has a role here. Those that dwell on fees, on programs, on debt, on governance, on kinds of knowledge, and on treatment of race, gender, sexuality, and class in the university. But I'll conclude by saying it's really important that we keep our eye on what we're fighting against and how enormous it is, and on what we're fighting for and how invaluable it is. Namely, knowledge that makes us capable of building an alternative world to one that is ruled by the nightmarish legacies of the past in combination with a fully financialized order of value. Thank you.
Our next speaker needs a very long introduction. Judith Butler. Thank you for joining us. This is also a second visit for Judith to UWC. So.
Great. I'm really pleased to be here. I wanted to start with a brief quotation from Gramsci. He writes, "Destruction is difficult. It is as difficult as creation." So I'm honored to be here. I know that I've just arrived and that you have been in the middle of an important and critical movement in the last months, seeking to know whether the universities in South Africa can be freed of their apartheid legacy. This is a huge, overdue, and momentous question, and I can only follow you as you work this out for yourselves. I do see, however, that in Cape Town, in Buenos Aires, in Istanbul, Athens, New York, and Berkeley, some questions are facing us all, even as they are different, emerging from different histories and in their own idioms. Can the university remain a site for critical thought when its structures, even its forms of knowledge, are mired in colonial relations, in racist epistemologies, and class differentials? In addition, faculty, staff, and students in so many parts of the world are questioning whether universities, which are becoming increasingly corporate in their structures, are now guided by measures of evaluation, as Wendy has just suggested, that seem far removed from the scholarly and political values we teach, we write about, and that we treasure most. Perhaps we can say, without overreaching, that one of the contemporary implications of the university seems to be this: none of us any longer has an option to avoid thinking about the conditions under which we write, think, and teach, whether it is the history that wrought the structures within which we teach and write, or the financial condition that determine how and whether we are paid, and how the value of our work is or is not recognized. We have now to reflect on the historical and institutional conditions that have made our knowledge possible in order to find out when a formation proves to have been a deformation, but also to come to know and claim forms of knowledge that have been ruled out and demeaned by the prevailing metrics of value. Perhaps also we have to take stock in the moment and as it happens of the fate of what we might call the critical humanities and the arts that have, as they are increasingly underfunded, and why. They do not conform to those modes of rationality that are gaining dominance, conferring value on the work we do, including efficiency, marketability, profit, impact, and conforming with standards of excellence that confer international prestige. In South Africa and throughout the global South, to conform to international standards of excellence, and I can only put that in quotation marks, can sometimes translate into the imperative to mime European forms of knowledge resubmitting to colonial and racist regimes of power. I say this as someone trained in European philosophy. I could not think without it, but that is not the only way I think. But most important is that we take the time to think together in public on the conditions and possibilities of a radical critique, understood not only as a style of thought or a potential niche within the academy. If we are to think about the university, its conditions of possibility, and its forms of radical foreclosure, that is, what it rules out or demeans as knowledge and expression, then we have to take leave of its established forms in order to open up the question of its future. So though we are within the university, trained by its disciplines, we are also engaged in forms of radical critique that seek to understand what forms of power are consolidated by disciplines and their punitive standards, and what kinds of knowledges pass between universities and their publics, transdisciplinary or intradisciplinary, and critical, and what kinds of knowledges are constituted through free and open public debate on the conditions of our work, that is, the conditions of our reading, writing, and thinking, what constrains us, what compels us, what threatens us with exclusion. Now, when I refer to radical critique, I do not mean a negative or destructive activity, though there is always some destruction in the course of change. The status quo is negated to some degree, and though some might call that violent, I want to suggest that it can be a dismantling that is done in the name of values that are yet to be institutionalized, values that remain largely extra-institutional, and whose institutional embodiment is a question and a challenge. Of course, one clear value that is asserted by the recent student movements is that universities should be affordable to everyone, and that class and race oppression follow when fees are raised. At the same time, we see that this claim is not enough, for there are public and free universities in Mexico and Argentina that remain mainly white and wealthy. Even where there is no explicit racial discrimination, the universities are understood to be, in those areas, made for certain populations and not for others. What and how do we understand this racial and demographic bias, and through what mechanisms does it reproduce itself? Of course, we ought to fight for the affordability of universities. There is no question. But making universities affordable does not fully address the question of how best to democratize the university. That is, how to redress the failure to democratize university life, to make it accessible and affordable to students across racial and class lines, to women and to all minorities, including queer and trans people, and to develop curricula that speak to the histories of the subjugated and the marginal, and that allow for new forms of imagining the future. In these same universities, affordable but not yet accessible, the dominant value systems give priority sometimes to technical innovation of the kind that corporations will like, to inventions, especially the kind that can be sold for profit, neoliberal metrics and standards of utility, all of which adversely affect the development of programs in the humanities, the arts, and undermine the possibility of critical thought. Of course, even impact, that term that has become a key word of austerity, presumes that knowledge is good if it has an impact on the world, but that certainly does not include modes of social transformation that seek to change our very conception of the world or indeed to democratize our universities. Indeed, those latter forms of change are not measurable. They are considered to be distractions, speculations, counterproductive, and to be devalued if not explicitly opposed. Time and again and across the globe, we see that value is given to knowledge produced within the university that reflects on that university's status, as Wendy has explained. And as a result, what becomes devalued are those forms of knowledge produced outside the academy or that pass into and out of the university from and to cultural spaces through community art projects, through intellectual activities linked with social movements in and through the media and in the context of democratizing social movements. Of course, the classroom is crucial to this process. It is or should be an experiment, a critical experiment, but what happens in the hallways is also important, and on the campus, in discussions, in protests and public assemblies. And all those sites are potential sites of knowledge. They are also potential sites of expression, and their censorship comes at the expense of thought itself. So what I am suggesting is that when we think about the university as a place where radical critique can happen, we have to think of its borders as porous, as passages between the outside and the inside. We have to be outside even when we are inside in order to think critically, and we have to be inside even when we are outside to make a difference in changing the structure and aim of the university. Especially for countries and regions that have emerged from dictatorial or colonial rule or from apartheid, or those that have claimed to have emerged or who are proclaimed now to live in democracy. This is all quite relevant. What stories are officially promulgated about the transition to democracy? What if that transition is not complete, or if major dynamics of oppressive regimes continue to structure everyday life, demanding critical attention and theorization? It is, of course, intensely debated whether contemporary South Africa has emerged from apartheid, even though the assumption that it has emerged is affirmed by every university that seeks to make a claim on international recognition. And yet the claim presupposes a certain way of telling a history or failing to tell a history. And it disavows and so perpetuates the ways that racial inequality and injustice are linked to forms of economic injustice, deflecting from the enormous class differentials in which the poor are disproportionately black and where significant hierarchies of value still exist between traditionally black universities and traditionally white ones. So what does it mean? What would it mean to emerge from apartheid? If apartheid continues to haunt and structure many aspects of life, is there then no difference between then and now? Or are we talking about a partial emergence from that system, one that has to be named, narrated, and critically dismantled? Is there an operation of critical dismantling and affirmation that is yet to be done? How is that to be done? Who does it? Where and how? This would all be lovely and radical as a thought experiment if it were not for the fact that violence is everywhere in this discussion. There seems to be no way to think about radical critique without coming to terms with the question of violence. Should the tactics of radical critique be violent? And if so, how is that distinguished from the sorts of violence waged against those who dare to ask these questions and to call for the radical transformation of the university? When police or security personnel or military personnel, all of which are blended in increasingly militarized police and security forces, when they come onto campuses seeking to restrict rights of speech, expression, assembly, and mobility, then an alliance is struck between an increasingly managerial university administration and an increasingly securitarian, militarized police force. In the US, student protests are now often approached with tactics designed to suppress enemy combatants on domestic soil. Really, really. At what point does dissent get called violent? And at what point does security become the alibi for censorship and political suppression? This is doubtless an increasingly globalized condition in which radical critique risks becoming criminalized. How then to think through to think through and against this violent suppression to keep forms of radical critique alive? To what extent is radical critique during our time obligated to become a critique of violence and to know what contemporary modes of violence are? Okay, so what I'm arguing is that, in fact, it's important to be dismantling certain kinds of structures, but if we end up reproducing violence, then what have we done? We have become more like those we oppose than we would ever wish to be. In the past, universities in Greece and in South America, in the immediate aftermath of authoritarian rule, were immediately declared to be sanctuaries or asylums from which police were barred. The reason is that police had been used to entering campuses and suppressing dissident speech, arresting students and faculty critical of the government, subjecting them to detention, imprisonment, torture, and disappearance. Of course, we've seen that in the last months, intensive police suppression on many campuses. At Nehru University, student leaders, including Kanhaiya Kumar, were arrested for trumped-up charges of sedition, and according to recent accounts, slogans and declarations were attributed to those students that were never made. In Greece, some years ago, the academic asylum law that barred police from campuses was passed. It was the 1980s, before the fall of the military junta, or actually after the fall of the military junta in 1974. It required police to seek permission of a prosecutor before entering the grounds of higher education. And that was a response to the brutal murder of students at the Polytechnic in Athens in 1973. Before the election of Syriza, there were massive strikes against the Papademos government, the asylum law was broken, and police flooded a campus in Thessaloniki to suppress student dissent. Now the law of asylum is reinstated, and I propose it should be instated for every university. Why shouldn't we open up again this idea of asylum, of sanctuary, the university as a place of sanctuary for students where police presence carries with it the threat of violence and suppression by the state? In Turkey, most recently, academics who signed a peace petition were detained, accused of complicity with Kurdish terrorism. What did they do? They called for a resumption of peace talks between the Kurdish Freedom Party and the Turkish government. And what about the drawn-out trial of Pinar Selek, who committed the crime of teaching about Kurdish history? Let us note as well the operation of security forces on campuses here, in Cape Town and in Johannesburg, intervening in assembly, suppressing speech, invoking some kind of interdict, and enacting forms of violence on student protests. Is it really enough to say that protests had become disruptive to unleash the police on students? Is this what the university is for? Why, we might ask, is disruption not welcome when there is clearly still so much to disrupt? Let us remember that the reason for that is that universities are not just places for the efficient and unobstructed execution of teaching and research, where the value of security is more important than the value of critical thought and radical imagining. Universities are ideally sites for extracurricular associations and debate on public and political issues of common concern, supporting open contestations and disagreements. Those disagreements can be, and increasingly are, over the conditions that structure university life itself. Who is enrolled and who has to leave because she cannot pay? Whose labor is outsourced? What counts as knowledge? And how are those forms of knowledge linked to the reproduction of racial categories? What is the relation between the university, its history, its economic and political conditions, and the very possibility to imagine otherwise? To answer that question, one would have to know the time one is living in, and there seems to be no agreement on whether or not South Africa has emerged from apartheid. Emerging still, emerging again. Emergence itself is a slow and painful process that involves seeing how deeply that system pervaded institutions and minds, the very sense of time, space, and world. Such a change is not quite imaginable without a profound disruption. We can call it an upheaval, understood precisely as a point of departure for a new university and a more radical emergence from living legacies of subjection and inequality, and perhaps also the promise of a new sense of world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Judith. Okay, let's invite our last speaker, Achille Mbembe, who is from Wits Institute for Social and Economic Research, WISER, and he knows that some of us at UWC refer to ourselves at the Center for Humanities Research as none the wiser. So he's in good company. Achille.
I'm not going to talk about decolonization, I assure you. The last time I went to Google to check what was going on with the term, I did notice that it's almost everywhere. There is no space today that is not saturated by the term decolonization. There is the injunction to decolonize is everywhere. I even fell onto the title of a conference called Decolonizing the Orgasm. So today, so the injunction to decolonize is, and they were very serious. I mean, this was not a matter of a joke. I mean, you can check it if you want. I'm not inventing it at all. The injunction to decolonize is almost like the injunction for almost everything to fall. That we are at a moment when everything or everybody must fall. And Judith just told us that, in fact, why should we stop since there's still so much to destroy? But I think that as we are destroying, as we are busy destroying, it might also be useful to ask whether there is anything that can be saved from destruction. I think it's useful too to wonder to what extent our way of destroying is different or similar to the neoliberal ways of destruction. Because there is destruction and destruction. At what point is it that we make those clarifications? It seems to me, as David, Wendy, and Judith suggested, a very important issue. Second, to bring the debate a bit closer to our location here, it seems to me that at the end of apartheid, we, of course, inherited a very stratified, highly unequal, deeply hierarchical, and rather disjunctive higher education landscape. UWC is not the same as the University of Venda. University of Venda is not the same as Fort Hare. Fort Hare is, of course, not the same as UCT. UCT is not exactly the same as WITS, which is not the same as UJ. So that is what we have inherited. And I don't think that the mergers of the early 2000s resolve that dilemma. If anything, the mergers radicalized the contradictions that were already embedded in this kind of kaleidoscopic landscape. And these contradictions, I think, are now exploding in our face. They're exploding in our face, and they are suddenly highlighting what seems to me, but look, we are here somewhat share with you some really serious ideas, but also open a space for discussion. What seems to me to be typical of something generic we could call the South African university. What is it? It's the fact that the South African university, of course, has many different faces. I have just alluded to that. But it has something that brings all these different faces together. It is an ethno-racial university. I'm sure that there are many other ethno-racial universities elsewhere in the world, but typical of this historical form here in South Africa is the fact that it was conceived of and it has been operating as an ethno-racial entity. And what has happened, part of the current crisis we are facing, is symptomatic of our failure to undo the ethno-racial university, which means to turn it into a truly public university. At a time, and this is not at all easy, at a time when the very idea of the public, that is that which must be shared equally among equals. That's what the term public means. That which, as equals, we have to share equally. At a time when, as David, Wendy, and Judith have told us, that very idea is no longer really the project of democracies. Democracies are turning their back onto that idea. At a time when that idea is undermined from all sides, and not only by market forces, but also, as we can see here in Russia, in other parts of the continent, by an increasingly predatory and kleptocratic state or elite. That is impoverishing the public domain, that is weakening institutions as a mode of governance, that you create chaos as a way of governing, as a way of privatizing. The inability to imagine a renewed idea of the common, and the over-reliance, I would suggest, on difference as the foundation of the political. So it seems to me that all of this is making it really difficult for us to move from an ethno-racial university to a genuinely public university that responds to all the demands that are coming out, not only here, but in India, in Brazil, in England, in most parts of this world of ours, which has become extremely heterogeneous, and in which the politics of enmity has become the dominant mode of relation, or solving conflicts, war becoming the sacrament of our epoch, so to say. So it seems to me that these elements have to be brought into our conversation. The third point I would like to make, which goes alongside what Judith, Wendy, and David told us, is that it may be that the university as we knew it is dead. It might be that we are fighting an enemy that died long ago. And this happens, these things happen very often in the history of societies. That really passions and energies, capital, resources, knowledge, huge amounts of all of this are unleashed in a fight against something that has long been dead. And we have to ask ourselves, to what extent this might be part of what's going on in this country now. We really have to face such questions. And I'm not just proposing it as a view of the mind. I think that there are instances as such when we are busy fighting against things which are completely dead. And then we get possessed by all of that. And of course, we waste a lot of time. Meanwhile, of course, the rest of the world is going somewhere else. I suggest that we think about it very seriously. So it might be that the university as we knew it is dead. The fact, and that's how I understand David's concept of the Uberversity, which is very different from the pluriversity of the decolonials. But look, we need as many concepts as we can get. The fact is that a global restructuring of higher education started right at the beginning of the 20th century. And I say global because we tend to think in terms that are so South African-centric. We believe that, look, we are so special, we end up believing we are like Americans. They believe in something called American exceptionalism. And our brothers and sisters, African Americans, are the biggest believers in American exceptionalism. And we in South Africa, we're a bit like that. You see, I'm saying we in South Africa. We are a bit like that. We have had all these student movements going on, I can't remember since when. We think that, okay, all of this starting here. There haven't been any student movement in the rest of the continent. We do not bother about looking into what has happened in the rest of Africa, of which we are an integral part. Because if the name is South Africa, what is the meaning of Africa in South Africa? The biggest, the most radical student movements in the continent have taken place in Ethiopia. But you don't hear anything about that in our, it's nowhere, it's not on the map, nothing. So can we really keep going on like that? Can we afford, from an intellectual, political, and philosophical point of view, can we afford that kind of blindness? Of course we cannot. Of course, if we persist in it, we will reach a cul-de-sac, we will bang our heads against a wall, and of course everything will fall. Not because we engineer it, but because we are possessed by some kind of thing that inhabits us in a way we don't control any longer. So the global restructuring of higher education hasn't started yesterday. It started at the beginning of the 20th century. Today, it has reached probably its final stage. I don't have the time to go through the details, so I'm being somewhat telegraphic. I hope I'm not caricaturing myself. It is today at its final stage. And when you talk to big companies, people who really manage big amounts of money, I'm not talking of $1 billion or how much was it, 247 million rands? We're not talking about that. That is peanut. We're talking about real money. When you talk to people who manage real money and ask them, okay, what do you think of this thing called the university? They will give you a few answers. First of all, they will tell you that universities have become too expensive. What does it mean, too expensive? Of course, we have to debate that. What do we mean by too expensive when, for instance, in South Africa, we spend something like 0.7% of our wealth on higher education? Is it expensive to invest 0.7% of our GDP on preparing for the future of those who come after us? I don't think it is expensive. I think that we have to recapitalize our universities. We have to fight for a recapitalization of South African universities. And that has to be part of the agenda. And that won't be done. Where is the Vice Chancellor? Is he still around? He's gone. Okay, you tell him. It can be done by the Vice Chancellor. The Vice Chancellor should be enrolled in a bigger fight to recapitalize South Africa's higher education. And this is done in Parliament. So, look, I mean, I don't want to go for too long. I had some other comments to make. The fact is that what we call big business, those people who have money, they believe that it's too expensive, they believe that it's too fragmented, they believe that it is too nation-state centric, and they believe that we have to move towards a kind of post-national or at least partially denationalized higher education space that provides for the kind of labor that transnational global capital needs today. The consequences of these are extraordinary. The consequences are, for instance, that we will have universities will enter into a new age of, let's call it global apartheid. You see, the paradox of our times is that as apartheid is, I don't know, Judith, whether it has ended here or not, that's clearly part of the debate. But as we are trying to decommission apartheid here, it has a big future globally. It has a huge future globally. So a denationalization and transnationalization, which has led to the defunding of major public institutions, the zoning of numbers of universities that do not qualify for the kind of new global landscape required by capital. And these are some of the challenges we have to face. As South Africa, we can face those challenges. We can face them. How? First of all, by recapitalizing universities. The intensity of the fights we are involved in can be explained to some extent by the fact that we are fighting over crumbs. That is a fact. So, recapitalization, we have to, can we, for instance, compete with China in attracting African students to our shores? Most students from the rest of the continent today go to China for all kinds of reasons. Can we compete on that market? Yes, we can compete. We have the means to do so, and it will be good for South Africa and for the continent. We can do it, but at certain conditions. Reform, for instance, our immigration laws. Make sure that African professionals can move back and forth in helping to constitute this country as a major player in the global reorganization of the intellectual map, because that is what is going on, and others are doing better than we do. The Gulf countries, Singapore, Taiwan, we have the resources to do that. What is lacking is the imagination. So let me end with that. For a plea for a renewed imagination in terms of not only our location in this continent, in terms of our reactivating the idea of the public, of the common, where the over-reliance on difference and the difference of the difference of the difference has become more or less the kind of deadly moral economy of our politics. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ashil, on fire. So let's open up for a round of questions. We'll take 3 at a time. I know there are going to be many, many questions, but if you could direct your questions to the speakers.
Man, where does one start? Okay, I think we have to start with the violence that's perpetuated against students by police. You know, there's this violence that was perpetuated against us last and early this year. Tear gas, rubber bullets, all these things, stun grenades. And these academics that you're talking to, these intellectuals did nothing. Nothing. No petition, no nothing. These people did nothing. You know, this is what I hate with intellectuals and academics. You just remain intellectuals and academics. You have a holdover student intellectual. That's all you have. There's nothing else. Because you come here, you talk in radical language, and you do nothing in action. You come here, you have black people who romanticize because they want to be loved by whites. And, you know, that's why it ends, these things. The truth is this. You intellectuals, but this thing doesn't represent the demographics of the country. Most people are illiterate. And what we are talking about here will not reach the townships, these camps that are created by whites for us. They will not reach these places. So you come here, you talk, intellectual, don't do an academic. But this thing will never solve anything for our people in the townships. Our people remain poor, marginalized, underdeveloped, and all is happening. We have people from America, wherever you're coming from, you want to solve African problems. Problems that are created by yourselves. You want to solve them again.
Aban, can you ask a question?
There's no question, I'm commenting.
My question is directed to Judith Butler. In your presentation, you used 2 very important concepts, which are violence and disruption. And I don't know what you mean by these 2 words. When are actions disruptive and when are actions violence? Wouldn't it be based on who is considering them as either violent or disruptive? Given the example you alluded to, the insider and outsider. So what is violent and what is disruptive? Thank you.
In response to the gentleman's speech there, can I ask the panel one question? Can they perhaps answer and tell us what the importance is of radical language in change and how radical language will survive whatever is happening now in future?
I do think that it matters a great deal who is defining violence and who is naming what kind of conduct or expression violence and for what purpose. So I think we always have to ask the question, within what interpretive frame is violence being named, right? Now, I don't believe that all forms of disruption are violence, and I make a distinction between that. So I actually called for greater disruption. I didn't call for greater destruction. I think maybe there was a mishearing there. Although I also think there are forms of destruction that are nonviolent. So that makes me even more complicated and very academic, and I'm sorry. But the thing is that I do think that it is very often the case that student protests that are disruptive are called violent in order to have the alibi for bringing in the police or the security. And so the real question is how do we think about those perceptual frames and that language and how to talk back to it. Now, I also think there's, of course, always and still an active debate about violent versus nonviolent tactics, and that's a larger debate, and I'm sure we probably have differences of opinion about that here. And of course, there's also a difference between violence against property and violence against persons, and I know that that's an active anarchist debate, for instance, throughout the world. I myself do support principles of nonviolence, and I think that it is important that our criticism be strong, that our disruption be real, and that there be a sanctuary for protest, assembly, demonstration, for loud and angry opposition. I do think that violence destroys our world and does not create our world. And I do believe what we have to do is dismantle a world that has made life unlivable for many people in order to create a more livable world. And I don't believe that violence is generative of a more livable world.
Hi there. I think my question is actually directed at the whole panel, specifically first to Ashil in terms of recapitalizing universities. Do you not feel that that reapplies problematic and capital-intensive stratifications in our society already by centralizing capital in spaces where there are already those kinds of racial and class stratifications? And then for the rest of the panel, the way that we talk about the universities is almost as if it's self-evident that they're necessary, but we're not talking about communities that are already, in terms of the subject matter that we engage with, they are the embodied kind of realities of what it is that we only intellectualize about. And in a lot of ways, what we talk about is actually a way to legitimize what their existence is already legitimizing, and is in fact a derailment from what is their embodied experience. So how do we, in terms of the university, actually act as, or people who operate within the university or the academy act as a support to communities that already exist, as opposed to spotlighting and gaslighting and taking the kind of voices out of the throats of people that are actually doing the important work that we don't have the bravery to actually do?
Wendy, my question is for you, and I wanted to ask, I mean, your whole idea of financialization was really titillating, to say the least, but I wanted to ask about whether we should caution ourselves also not to get marred too much with kind of technical economic talk, because I think what we're really losing is the recuperation of the idea of the public. Because for the most part, corporate companies, I mean, let's imagine that the university in fact does achieve and we manage to get out all the financialization. Then big corporate companies can build their own universities under states that, support neoliberalism. Then we can have Nike School of Economics. We can have Pfizer School of Medicine. We can have, Anglo-American School of Engineering. So I think what we're also losing is not just about how to structure the university economically, but how to recuperate and reinstate a particular public idea and value of knowledge and intellect. And I'm not trying to kind of, diminish the importance of deeply understanding how the financialization structures the university. In fact, it produces certain types of values, but where the emphasis is here, because, we could have universities that are decolonial with only 2 students, while Pfizer and Nike have many students in their lecture rooms geared towards a neoliberal economy. So if you can just help me unravel that a little bit.
Who are the social and political allies of the university project? Because all of us here, I imagine anyway, are in or from the university. But in the big political struggle that you're describing, we need allies outside our circle. Who does the panel think those allies are, or how do we create them?
The first question is to the panel, and it's regards to the gentleman that made a comment in the first. And it made me think, and he raises a very important point. Can the subaltern speak? Or was it foreclosed by Spivak? And I think that's the kind of question that he has, the kind of conundrum that we currently have in South Africa. There's a large group of oppressed people, but there are certain representatives of the university that speak on behalf of them. But when it comes to real manifestation on the ground, that doesn't happen. And then the second question is with regards to the recapitalization. Who's responsible for it? And Wendy remind us that there's specific conditions that those money comes within a particular value. So if we recapitalize the university, where are we going to end up?
Thank you. This is basically to the whole panel. It strikes me that the university is coming under two pressures, under many, but two that we can speak to tonight. Financialization on one side, and then a belief that the institution of the academy is irrelevant, and that it produces a certain kind of knowledge that's not relevant to a lot of the population at the moment. And one of the things that concerns me is an anti-intellectualism that supports neoliberal desires. And I feel like the academy is being destroyed from within by a very difficult anti-intellectualism. So my question is, how can we support decolonization, and we can support marginalized knowledges in a way that supports, as the gentleman at the back said, knowledge and intellect in a way that's congruent, but that doesn't destroy? How can we create universities that we can believe in and that we want to be part of, rather than that we want to destroy?
The question I think that all of us are asking, and I'm really including everyone in this room, is what is a university for at this historical conjuncture? Is it still a place in which it is possible to produce the knowledge, the learning, the reflection, the thinking that can make a new and different world in all kinds of different ways, through sciences, social sciences, technologies, humanities, arts, poetry, song, etc.? Or is it for something else? Has it been already so captured by privatization that both the learning within it and the research within it really are just cheap appendages for capital that allow the university to be a not very efficient and not particularly well-run domain for generating bits of human capital on the one hand, and on the other hand, generating research that otherwise various corporations, Nike, Pfizer, et cetera, would have to do all on their own instead of through their much cheaper public-private partnerships. And all of us are kind of dupes in that activity. Or is it something more complex than all of this? And I want to suggest we are in a more complex space than either being completely captured and already so far down the road to privatization and neoliberalization that that nothing here is worth doing because there's no thinking, no reflection, no reading, no learning, no imagining of new possibilities. I don't think we're that far down the road, but I think we are at a really crucial conjuncture. So that's my preface to 3 quick answers. Why does financialization matter? Why did I drag you through that compressed tutorial? Because I think our diagnosis of our condition matters both to how we address it and to what kind of alternative world we might be trying to bring into being. And if we think what we have is simply a world where students are consumers and faculty have been turned into shopkeepers or provisioners or providers, and don't grasp the way we are being governed by a financialized order of value, we are at risk of doing precisely what one interlocutor suggested, which is recapitalize an institution that is governed by a financialized order of value. And what the hell for? Why would we do that? We don't want to make huge arguments and engage in a huge struggle to recapitalize a university or universities that basically become in service to the existing order of capital and its other dimensions of historical legacies that have to do with stratifications along race and gender and other lines. That wouldn't be the purpose. So if we don't get the diagnosis right, and if we don't understand how we ourselves and universities as a whole, even well-intentioned lefties are caught in the rankings and ratings world, if we don't understand how universities are governed and how we are governed by a financialized order of things, we won't know what to fight, and we will simply bring those values into our classroom and into our research and into our everyday life. So that's why I think it matters. Last point I want to make, who are our allies? That is such an important question. We will get nowhere if we're simply here with ourselves trying to figure out what to do about an institution that seems to be pretty close to finished, or, as Achille said, is already dead. Feels like we're alive. But here I just want to say, and it will be interesting to some of you and perhaps not to others, we're in a version of Rousseau's paradox, and that paradox goes like this. In order to be able to generate a good polity with equality, democracy, shared power, human beings governing themselves, you have to have citizens who are educated to want that. And in order to educate citizens to want that, you have to have a polity that already has those values. That's the paradox. And we are in the grips, as several of you have suggested, of being so neoliberalized inside and out that we don't have the culture of desire for an educated citizenship, for equality, for shared power, for radical forms of democracy, or even representative liberal forms of democracy. Those are gone. So the question is, where are our allies? And I'm not going to answer it, but I do think there are domains of desire across class and across race and across caste in most societies where the value of not only becoming a thoughtful, deliberative, educated person, but the value of delivering such people to be self-governing, to making people, again, self-governing, or for the first time self-governing, is still a value. And I don't think it's limited to an elite, and I don't think it's limited to an underclass, and I don't think it's limited to the dispossessed. But I think our task, if we are serious about renewing the possibility of universities as something other than appendages to capital at this point, is to find those allies across class, across caste.
I just want to say, when Spivak asked, can the subaltern speak, she did not answer with a no. Okay, she never said it could not speak. What she asked a sort of similar question to our friend up here, whether the dominant modes of representation, the dominant modes of discourse, permit for the subaltern to become a subject who speaks, right? So she was calling attention to certain kinds of language, certain kinds of representation. She thought we had to take them on, we needed to subject them to radical criticism, what she would call deconstruction. And that was what she was doing. So I don't think she foreclosed that. I think that question was an indictment against dominant modes of speaking. Okay, so we got that again, so we had a nice Spivakian moment in the corner. And I guess I want to say that there are sort of two questions on the table. One, who are the allies of the university, but also who are we within the university allied with? And that was an important question. And I actually think the future of the university does lie in establishing its absolute obligation to its constituent communities. In other words, if there's not a link between universities and the communities they serve, then they are de-democratizing. And that has to happen. And, I don't know, you know that. You don't need some American coming to tell you that, but I said it anyway.
Yeah, I can't resist this one about the subaltern. Once, I think I was with David or John Komarov, one of those Capetonians. One of those white Capetonians. If only we can really determine that he's white, which I'm not sure of that. But we were going to the Pilanesberg, and along the road, every 2-3 kilometers, a huge whatever, Jesus is the answer. And then we saw it 3-4 times, and then at some point somebody asked me, Jesus is the answer, but what is the question? I mean, the thing with the subaltern, it seems to me the subaltern speaks all the time. The question is, who's listening? Is anybody listening? It seems to me that is, this from our experience, that is probably a more productive question than Spivak original one, but that's something we'll talk about with Spivak. Recapitalization. You see, I am in favor of destroying capitalism. I'm not. Is that surprising? Okay, I'll tell you now. I'm not sure that we can destroy capitalism tomorrow. In the meantime, if we cannot destroy it tomorrow morning, it means we have to do something in the direction of destroying it and be somewhat pragmatic. And one way of being pragmatic in our context, I'm not sure about other contexts, one way of being pragmatic is to create the mechanisms that allow the state as the signifier by excellence of public good to be able to regulate capitalism. And the recapitalization of universities, I mean, we can discuss about the term or whatever, becomes therefore an imperative in that context. It raises all sorts of questions. To what extent is it that we can recapitalize universities in light of the stratification and the hierarchies and the inequalities I have mentioned earlier on? The other question is that, I mean, we do not live in an island. We have to compete with other nations. We will have to compete. And we can compete if we think carefully. Some universities can become competitive if we invest in them, let's say over 10 years. Others would need 20, 25 years to be able to compete. Competition doesn't mean that these cannot become democratic spaces. That's what China is doing, for instance. In China, what they have done is that they have identified a list of those universities which, if they are given the proper incentives over a certain period of time, will be able to redirect the flow of knowledge, which for the time being comes from the north, comes in the south. We deal with data, they deal with theory. How is it that we change the terms of this unequal redistribution of knowledge at a global scale? We still need knowledge, for instance, to provide shelter, to provide food, to build roads, to make sure that Africa is connected within itself, we need that technical knowledge. Nobody will come and say that we don't need it. So universities need to keep producing that kind of knowledge. They are not the only spaces to produce it, but there are things, certain ways of posing questions which should not elide the specificities of our current position in the international, in the global world. There are things we need in capitalism. Not everything in capitalism is bad. So we have to identify what are those aspects of capitalism which are creative, which are needed, and what are the ones that should be discarded. So my position is rather a social democratic one. Of course, it has its limits, but that's what I believe is good for us here.
David?
So a couple of things. You were with both of us when Jesus was the answer.
You were
right?
with two scholars.
Sorry? Two scholars, right. The other is just to put on record that Sheila's gone on record tonight for being against capitalism and for recapitalization. Right? More serious, and social democracy, yes, indeed, important third point. A couple of things, sort of running some of the questions together. The concern, or the issue is not about radical language in the account, so much as it is about modes of analysis that produce a comprehension in the name of which one can mobilize or generate activism around and for and against those things where those things are necessary. Action without thought, to use a phrase of somebody else, is blooming, buzzing confusion. And thought or ideas need not necessarily lead to action, but they're necessary in order to think through where action might be needed or more compellingly where action is necessary. So I think there's a key set of concerns at place over here. When we say that the university is irrelevant, perhaps we're saying that only part of the university is irrelevant, a particular part of the university that thinks in sorts of ways. And that then frees up, right, the university to nothing but its technocratic enterprise of skilling and nothing else, right? And I think we ought to resist that undertaking with every fiber in our bodies, which is not to say the university is now, as it never really ever was, but probably less than it ever was, the only side of knowledge production and knowledge creation and learning. It is now, perhaps more than it's ever been, one side amongst others that might or could or should be mobilized at various points to various purposes, because it comes with a whole range of resources, right, that might need recapitalizing in some ways, and constantly are being recapitalized in a variety of ways, some of which are better than others. Right? And so I think we need to think very carefully about what we're calling for when we say that the university is no longer a place to be. Why are we all here otherwise?
Firstly, I'd like to say that I'm quite worried that, yet again, that Africans are being dictated to how to think and how to re-envision and envision the society that we see fit. But anyhow, I appreciate the panel that's here. Firstly, I would like to say to Wendy, you said the two most important features for an African university to have is bringing in the outsiders in, and you're speaking of those who are historically excluded. And I would like to say the answer to that is a free socialist education. And how would fund that, as Mr. Achille Bebe was speaking about the GDP and how it's not financed. Besides looking at that, we can also look at taxing the rich white minority here in South Africa. Also, I'd like to state that also when we speak about decolonization, we need to speak about decolonizing our minds in these spaces. The manner in which we are spoken to here is quite patronizing. It's quite undermining, it's quite problematic. And to Judith, You said, you iterated this question a couple of times. Has South Africa emerged from an apartheid state? I would like to give you an equal answer, and that is no. So when you understand that, you can then understand the modes of violence because we operate in. Because us as black bodies are in a state where we are at a daily basis experiencing violence. So therefore, we may have to respond in a violent manner. So therefore,
Sorry, one more.
I will also, on that narrative of decolonizing the space, take my one last point and pass it to my friend.
Hi. Look, I have one question for Achille. Achille likes talking about this difference as a mode of political mobilization in South Africa. I think in his mind, he wants to speak to the notion of the common, the public, as being a space that everyone can be in. But in our daily experience, we know that difference is the reason why Khumani Maxwele threw shit on roads. Difference is the reason why people here at Rez are getting raped. We know that difference is the reason why Tyrone Pistorius is not here, who is at the center of not transforming and blocking transformation in this institution. So I don't know what exactly is this difference that you always speak about as being a problematic feature in how young people talk about decolonization, and also the problematic notion that we have not done research and we are self-congratulatory with respect to issues of decolonization, and you speak about other African countries where you know that the media space is colonized by white racist supremacists that control the narrative and never give us a chance to see Africa in its own entirety. And that is also as a result of apartheid. So I don't know how you think about these problems. Israelite.
Thank you. All right.
Thank you.
I'm going to
Sorry.
ask Olena.
Sorry.
Sorry, brother. Sorry, brother. Brother, let me explain to you. Brother.
Can you
Ask
allow
your
us,
question.
please?
Ask your
Thank
question.
you. Thank you. Can you put the mic on? Prof, you have been speaking. I respect all of you in front of us. You have been speaking over us and allow us to speak and
I am
raise
allowing
things
you
here.
to speak, my
Please.
friend.
Thank you. Firstly, I respect all of you. And it's very difficult. It is very difficult to argue anything that you are saying. You are flirting with the truth, and a lot of these things that you are saying, true to what liberals are speaking about, you would never raise anything beyond the ambits of the law. You speak to us and say and speak about things of recapitalization. You speak other concepts which are very much technical, and you don't go outside of those concepts. And you don't understand that the reason that we are in the position that we are in is because the law is there, and you don't address that. Also, we are speaking decolonization here. Look at the space that we are in right now. Look at the space that we are in. And also, look at the format, the mode that you expected me and these people to speak when addressing these issues. You
Sorry,
speak of decolonization. I'm not speaking to you.
afraid.
Can you understand? This is not a personal attack. This is not a personal attack. And I'm only just making a political
I have no
critique.
reason. I'm just saying
I am making-
that these people have been here all day.
I'm
and they
not
need-
going to be long.
I'm sorry.
I'm not going to be long. Just shortly.
Look, I think what we'll do is you want to ask your question, then ask your question.
Yes, please. How are you serious about decolonization when you come to these spaces and the only sort of radicalism that you know is speaking truth to power in these spaces, and when students are being shot and when these conversations are being had on the streets, you are nowhere? How are you serious about decolonization?
Olela, do you want to ask a question?
Yeah, I wanted to make. I wanted to make a point about what I think is the challenge of the university within the context of what the challenge is for this country. And it seems to me that after listening to all of you guys, that we have a political body or a body politic in South Africa, at least. Ungathini njalo nami. So, aninambeko yazi?
Colleagues, let's
Ngiyaqala uyibona bona ndlela eniyenzayo. It's okay.
All right. I'm afraid I'm going. I'm afraid I'm.
Uyayifuna uyivala le ndithethayo? Niyafuna uyivala le ndifuna uthetha?
All right, colleagues, I think. All right, colleagues, thank you very much for this evening. Unfortunately, we're not going to hear more responses, but thank you. We had a wonderful discussion. Thank you very much for your contribution.